In this video, my sister Bea and I take a good look at the chart for British comedian and YouTube star Russell Brand, currently facing very disturbing allegations of sexual assault and emotional abuse. He claims that this whole thing is a media hit job, that everything that happened was consensual. However, the 4 women that are accusing him say otherwise, and in the meantime, his YouTube channel with 6.6 million followers has been demonetized, he has been dropped by his agent and book publisher, and his comedy shows are being shut down. And worst of all, the UK police is investigating to determine what charges might be filed. Brand's birth date and his birth time are known, and here is the chart we will be talking about in this video. Okay, so Capricorn rising.
Right.
And to me, the most obvious thing that immediately is the degrees, because Capricorn rising, 26, this puts the Pluto in the vicinity. And not only is it in the vicinity, it's opposite Venus.
Right.
And speaking of archetypes, the idea of controlling someone, abusing someone, the whole misbehavior on that level is very Plutonian.
Right.
And that it matches the chart almost perfectly. And then if you then say, well, what's the Pluto doing? The Pluto at birth is opposite the moon.
Right.
And Mars. So first of all, Pluto, Mars, and it's well known to be a high libido, but Pluto is always the overpowering energy. And my feeling has always been that when a person acquires power, the planet, expresses that power, and so the odds increase that a person like this would do what he did. In a sense, it's the archetypal thing of Persephone's getting abducted, and he's the one he's the purveyor, he's the one doing it. But then you would say, well, that's at birth, Pluto opposite Moon, Pluto opposite Mars. And then it circulates and lands on the ascendant and basically lands on top of him. And he's having to deal with it.
So if you look at, for me, when I looked at this chart archetypally, because that's my approach, I think of, the ascendant, so it's Capricorn in this case, right, is the face we give to the world, right? And it's interesting that in his case, he has taken on the mantle of being a guru of type, which does fit very much within the Capricorn sort of persona, the mask. You notice it's in Cancer, the ruler's in Cancer. And I think, one of the things that people have always said about Russell Brand, he's had many incarnations. He's a comedian, he's an actor, he's been on the left, and then on the right, and now on the extreme conspiracy side. He's kind of a little bit of a chameleon, but the thing about it is that he's always been seen as some sort of teacher in some way or guide, with particularly, and notice the sun and particularly Mercury in Gemini, with particularly good verbal abilities, which he's an incredible speaker. He speaks very quickly, and people, I find men are often dazzled. I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but they're dazzled by other men who speak quickly and are very, very articulate. And he can be. Well, I find just men generally, just because of their admiration for other troublesome figures like Jordan Peterson, etc. There seems to be a lot of emphasis placed on men who can communicate very well. Okay, so he is a communicator in that style. But when I think archetypally of what Gemini is about, it's a trickster figure, right? Okay, it's kind of slippery. So we have the sun, the solar path, mediated by Mercury, which is very strong, disposits, it rules that sun, sorry. Mm-hmm. And you get that trickster quality of a person who is constantly changing face. We don't know who he is. We don't know. Obviously, there are all these allegations right now. The whole COVID crisis, the rabbit hole kept getting deeper and deeper as people went into more and more extreme views. And he was one of the leaders in this. He became one of the leaders, but he didn't start out that way. So it's so interesting that all of these things are apparent in his chart when you look at it. And the other thing I would say is that, he was a heroin addict as well. And he's got Neptune opposite the sun.
Opposite the sun, yeah. Which, the thing you see in this chart too is this is the thing about the perils of, in a sense, supernormal talent. When you have access to a lot of resources, you often see all the outer planets are featured in strong ways because that enables the person to take those leaps that are beyond the Saturnian norms. And you notice Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, and Eris, all four. Uranus is square Venus pretty tightly. The Pluto is doing its thing opposite Mars. You said the possibility of the Pluto overpowering behavior, over libidinous and all of that. The Pluto moon to food. Moon is fundamentally food, is what you take in, both in the actual thing being food as well as any impressions. And then Neptune as the, spiritual, his thing about being a spiritual guru of sorts has Neptunian qualities, but also self-deception and deceiving others as well. That's part of it, because the trick with planets is expressing the high end can be really tricky, because if you're have an aspect, you can easily deceive yourself. This is something that I remember coming across a great Buddhist master who really talked about this, that constantly be on the lookout for self-deception, because then you take that into the world. You think that you're doing something good, but in fact you may be deceiving yourself, and then you deceive others. And he definitely, like you, when I was looking at him during COVID, he was doing the Tucker Carlson thing of asking questions. He'd say, well, what if the vaccine, and what is the approach? Who knows? And, there's always pharma this and the government that. Just creating a kind of, open-ended chaos. That's how I was looking at his message.
You'll also notice that by whole sign houses, that sun is in the 6th house, and he
Yes.
is running a wellness center, get this, for women. Which is sort of a combination of spirituality and wellness. And so you think to yourself, even that matches the idea. And, a lot of, and I'm not saying, there's a lot of kind of strange, what happens when these things are revealed, everybody has a theory, and then they become conspiracy theorists, and that, he knew this was going to break. So he basically started discrediting the mainstream media so people would be ready. But I don't look at it that way. I look at it the way that this Pluto people sometimes have an incredible fear of authority, and Saturn people can too, by the way. I mean, both can and you're right that on another level that he's carrying enormous archetypal energy. What I think is funny is he's got Venus in the 7th house, right, with Uranus square. And one of the stories about Russell Brand is he was married to the very well-known singer Katy Perry, who I think he basically announced that he was breaking up with her to her through an email or a text. So this is very sudden. It was very sudden, which fits that Venus Uranus, and also fits the fact that he would have issues with a long-term relationship. Although from now it seems he is in one. But yeah, it's like I wonder myself on an archetypal level, if you are carrying this much, all these planets are linked in, and they're all, if you notice, they seem to be all linked in a challenging aspect. So I wonder if you're carrying all of these planets, aren't you the perfect vehicle for other people's projections of these same planetary archetypes? You can look at any chart in history, right, and say these people cannot be this powerful if they're not somehow channeling something that is archetypally true for a whole set of people that want to believe this stuff. Maybe a lot of Pluto people, or a lot of whatever. I mean, people that have these kinds of wirings where they would be attracted to. So what's your belief on that? How does that sound to you?
Yeah, I agree. The thing is that it's a mystery how someone chooses to express their chart, and there are theories out there that maybe we don't have a lot of choice because we're wired a certain way, and it's almost predictable that the causes and conditions of our life will lead us into a certain thing. And it gets really complicated to know, why does this guy do this? And then, for example, suppose some guy down the street or a woman down the street has a really similar chart and they're doing something entirely different. And you have to dig into who knows what, genetics, all kinds of things. But that there are a lot of forces in this chart all over the place here, and that he is using them in ways that are questionable, let's just say. In my opinion, is pretty questionable. It means, in other words, that it's the idea that you appropriate the power for yourself. You take any planet and you decide, well, this is mine. Not really. It's a collective energy. It's something you have to be responsible around. And I mean, certainly this whole theme here with what he's in, the scandal that he's in, how do you get around that? He's saying it's consensual.
Well, there's more and more evidence that the consensual part is a bit dodgy because, and we have to put this in context. If he was an addict for a period of time, addicts sometimes behave in ways that even they later on can't even rationalize. So who knows what was going on there? But there seems to be more and more credible evidence, including texts that he wrote. So we will see how that plays out. But what's interesting about it is it's credible enough that his YouTube channel has been demonetized. His agency dropped him. He had these stand-up shows that were all gone. So, I mean, he is really, really going through a Pluto transit, the way we understand Pluto, which basically comes in and tears everything from underneath your feet. And the other interesting thing, as you mentioned at the outset, it's being done through Venus. And Venus, on your ascendant, you're already going to get something. But the Venus is women. Generally, that's one of the significations, right? And we bring in that Pluto. What does it bring into to the conversation when it does a transit? It brings in Pluto Moon and Pluto Mars, which are all much about power, right? Because sexuality can be a form of power, right? Or attainment of power. Yes. So it is extremely, extremely complicated for him. Now, I just want to make a point, because we've talked about this before in our podcast, that there are plenty of people with really tough aspects. One of the one chart I'm thinking of is Eckhart Tolle. He's born with a pretty tough chart. He did not, he's never been accused credibly of anything except, sitting around dispensing whatever wisdom he has. So you can live out a reality in very different ways. And so you have to bring in a whole bunch of things. This is not predetermined, or this is the way he had to behave.
Oh, totally. I mean, you can, probably the best example I can think of is this Buddhist master that lived in Canada that I studied one of his books, and it's also worn from, reading what he said, because he didn't really write. But this guy had a chart where everything was square, everything else, just this huge grand cross. In his life, he said, the only thing you should be doing here is awakening and discovering your true spirit. He had no time for anything else. So he was using all the dynamic forces that's what he did. He found illumination and then he taught it. So no, there is no excuse. Just because you have dynamic energies, that's actually the temptation, is to take them in and use them just for your ego. I mean, you can have some of that. I mean, if you were perfect, then you would do it perfectly. Maybe nobody's perfect, but when the bulk of it is going in that direction, it becomes a destructive force, because when you start talking about vaccines, the things people do in society, now you're affecting everyone and everything, and it's not a good thing. It's just not a good thing. Probably here, the fact that, notice that the three main outer planets are all above. They're the ones that he's known for. The other stuff is below. But the other thing you see too is Saturn is going to be, that's his natal Saturn, by the way. When you were saying earlier, Cancer, is because Saturn in Cancer rules the ascendant, the rising sign. Right. But in transit, right now it's in Pisces, but it's going to go into Aries. And he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 out of 11 planets are in cardinal. That is not going to be easy. So I bet you anything that he's going to face the music about a year and a half from now, when Saturn switches signs. Also, Neptune will go into Aries with Saturn. But the Saturn cycle, working on all your planets, in the context of this, because now we have a context, right?
Yeah, of course.
It's not good. Let's just say that.
No, I mean, it does not look good. And also, I mean, not only from the objective level, but if you're going to take this seriously as a map where things are activated, this is a particularly tough time. What's funny to me is this notion of this trickster archetype that I really go back to. I look at that Mercury. Oh, it's also retrograde. I don't know how in what kind of stage of the retrograde cycle it was, but he's born with a Mercury retrograde.
Yeah, you can see it here. He was born 5 days from when it went retrograde, and then 18 days later. So around age 18 is when it's going direct. And by the way, the fast talking, one way to, brilliant, fast talking, magnetic talking, Mercury trine Uranus up to the zenith. That's a good explanation, because the trickster and the talking, definitely Gemini, no question.
Right. And he is a very Uranian figure. I mean, that's brings in the Mercury, and the way he does it is through his speech. The way he attracted people is that he's very good verbally. He really is. And, he's played many roles. Like I said, he was once on the left, or whatever that means. I'm not even sure what that means anymore, but he had more progressive views. And, there has been, and this is where I'm talking about, maybe there are certain individuals that carry the archetypal weight of the whole culture. They have to, because the culture is giving them that power. I mean, he had millions of followers, right? And so he's carrying that Uranian kind of the outlier, the crank, the person that won't fit, that won't follow the rules. I mean, one of the things he was famous for, even before he went down these crazy rabbit holes, is he would tell people not to vote because voting didn't amount. And some people would say, well, there's logic to that. Voting doesn't, but no, that has never really, and there's no better example than the United States is something where that doesn't work. But the idea was he was carrying that Uranian energy of I am different. And one of the Uranus can be very narcissistic, and just that you notice that at the zenith. One of the things some of his friends have come out, some of his friends who have been ostracized by him, is that he's incredibly narcissistic, and if you oppose him, he will vanish you. And that seems like a very, very high-pitched Uranus, which is what that looks like to me.
No, and by the way, okay, so this is the problem with astrology in a certain sense, is that, at least the way I do astrology, I'm constantly making judgments.
Right.
And then a person can say, look, you're judgmental. Of course I'm judgmental. But by this logic, you wouldn't have any judges in the world. That's how judges work. You give them a case and they make a judgment. And my sense of this guy, honestly, he's not very smart. He's a woolly-minded blabbermouth. I heard him. I heard his basically his political discourse. He just throws things out there. There's no plan. There's no sense of anything. It's like he's picking at things. Oh, there's farmers ripping people off and causing all these problems. And then he was on the Bill Maher show at one point trying to explain his theories. And it got totally out of hand because, even Bill Maher, who can be pretty radical himself, was finally kind of saying, well, what should we do? It sounded like, we're going to have a revolution, or like, what are you saying? He reminds me of sometimes when you see a movie star, you think he might be smart, and then you hear them talk and you think, nah, this person doesn't really understand what's going on. Whereas there are other movie stars that are brilliant. You'll hear them explain the situation. So he is not impressive at all. Yes, I'm sure he's whatever. What does he do? Was he previously a comedian, or what was his previous thing?
He's a comedian. He's been in some movies. He was on some sort of Big Brother show. I didn't really follow him that closely until a particular time where he gave a really good speech, actually, early, like maybe around 2015. I can't really quite remember, to a group of college students and university students in the UK. And I thought, he's really interesting. He's very, engaging, because he's very good at that. But it does really actually, his chart highlights the rule you told me years ago, which is do look at that planet at the zenith, because we can't look at the Mercury as the archetype, but a lot of people have Mercury in Gemini or Virgo, very strong Mercuries, and they're not going around trying to upend everything. But that Uranus being so keyed in and so prominent, I think that is the role he's played. Basically, I am here to upset the apple cart, the establishment. Everything's wrong. He will interview cranks like Seymour Hersh, who was accusing the U.S. of non-credible things. Where you can accuse the U.S. of lots of credible things, but he's coming up with some crazy theory. He had him on. He has RFK Jr. What's that guy? The Robert Kennedy talking about how this is the candidate everybody should be looking at. He is attracted and attracts cranks like himself, right? So my view of it is that is because the cranks is an archetype. It's out there, and there are people who really relate to that. And the problem with that, I mean, we can say, well, that's okay. We live in a pluralistic society. We should have many opinions, and I'm with that. But some of these opinions hurt people. They really hurt people badly. Yes. And that's where you have to. This is where we have to analyze speech being such a fundamental thing to what he's about. The Mercury. Liz Green wrote in one of her books that the path to the sun is through the ruler of whatever the sun signs in. And in his case, it is definitely Mercury. It's a total verbal thing. That's how he makes all his money, right? And how he's influential. And so that's kind of like, I look at a chart and I think, look, he's out there, right? And we can't do anything more than now there's credible charges. They should follow through with it. But I always ask myself, if I am hooked into one of these people and I am listening to them, that it's an opportunity maybe to look at my own inner world and say, what is it being expressed that I can't express? Because, a highly Uranian person could be a great scientist, right? And go out there and change the world. It doesn't have to be a person denying that the material reality of certain things is actually true. So I think it's an invitation with any of the charts we analyze, certainly through when we do it in our podcast, to say, okay, what am I being hooked into? And can I develop the distance, just a little bit of distance to say, and then there's a second thing. I think we have to bring this up, and this is very clear to me. a lot of people who went down rabbit holes and had their rabbit holes monetized, it's very difficult to convince us. I don't know the exact quote. Someone wants to make a lot of money to change their mind about it because they're making a lot of money. And so once he started getting more and more followers, basically on this, people who never paid attention to him suddenly made him their guru because he was saying what they wanted to hear. Then, forget it. And where's the integrity? They don't even have integrity at that point. But, he might believe this. I don't know what he believes or not. Like I said, there's been too many weird changes in his life for me to even think I know what he believes.
No, well, but that's my point. See, this is my point that for me, when all is said and done, if I go to the root, he's just not very smart. I'm sorry. Even with all this, he's just not very smart because a smart person would not present his information the way he does. And I just listened to him and I thought, this is just gobbledygook. What you're saying, you're just talking. It's a little bit like in a way, Trump talks. He just word salad, puts it out there and throws spaghetti at the wall. It's like he sounds like he's onto something because he will point out things that are happening in the world. Sure, but it's like you're reading a list. Okay, great, fantastic. Now what? What's your plan? And once I know that, for example, you were one of those people that was agitating back at a time when in 2020, vaccines in 2020, 2021 were critical to the survival of society. Many people died, because they said, oh, it's not COVID.
Yeah.
There was all this data. And, he's the guy that would say, oh, well, maybe the data isn't true. It's like they create this doubt, right? It was being published where we knew that a lot of people were dying in red states because they didn't think it was real. This is where it comes home to roost. It's very dangerous. It's not just you're talking, you're having an effect. Like you said, millions of followers, they're watching you, they do what you say, can cost them their life, right?
I think, again, the trickster figure is a trickster to themselves. Let's bring in the Neptune opposite the sun, which is obviously key to his path, right? So he considers himself some sort of spiritual teacher or guru or whatever you want to call him.
That's funny.
Whatever he is, right? And to many, he's running a wellness center, for God's sake, whatever that means too. And, he's into meditation and all the things that I think we are good, that we agree are good things. But this delusion part, Neptune is, it's highly delusional in its shadow side, right? So
yeah,
there's to me, he could be believing all this stuff. He could just be a highly delusional human being who's going out there with salad. Now, I want to bring something up which might actually apply to Trump as well. Neptune is, to me, also associated with hypnosis. And there was a way that Trump speaks that I think this guy speaks as well. And the one who brought it up is another, incorrigible, horrible human being, in my view, Scott Adams, who brought up that he had taken a hypnosis course when he was younger for salesmen, right? And that's what Trump had done. And if you listen to the speech patterns, again, talking about Gemini, so we want to look at the speech patterns. One of the tricks that you do, and just watch it one day, but I know it's very hard to listen to either one of these people, but I know it's hard. But try to listen to this because this is very an interesting concept. And you and I both studied hypnosis, so we know how this works. One of the key ways you can actually hypnotize someone is by doing what's called, you start a loop and you don't close it. In other words, I start talking and I don't close that sentence. I immediately move to something else.
Yeah.
What the human brain does is it tries to stay with you because it's actually looking for that closure, right, at some point. And so you can do categories of loops so that you're going down and down and down, and then eventually you lose everybody, but the person is essentially hypnotized because their brain is trying to make sense of all of these weird, so I've often wondered if he got taught very early on that this is how you do The Art of the Sale, right, or whatever that silly book is, which he didn't even write because he can't write. But anyway, I wonder if he was taught early on that this is the way you communicate. And this is because this is what he does at rallies. They make no sense. Half of what he's saying.
Yeah. Well, but you know what it is, though? For that, you need the right audience as well.
Absolutely.
So that, in other words, the technique in hypnosis is if you say things that don't make sense, it actually entrances the person's mind and it puts them in a kind of a trance.
Yep.
And if they like your, like how they say a person's demeanor, he's really playing on the magnetic energy that this is Trump now. And same with Russell Brand too. The idea that he's got a sort of a nice feel, the way he is, the way he communicates, but you basically spout nonsense. Now, by the way, it's a lot more extreme than Trump, in my opinion, because Russell Brand I think he just doesn't really understand the logic of his own thinking. He doesn't quite put it all together, so he just throws things, and he's trying to sound like an intellectual, but to me, he sounds more like a bit of a fool. But the logic of what you're saying, yes, it's the sort of a sense that the person's magnetism carries the energy, but the sentences don't make sense. I mean, Trump, when I listen to him, within seconds I realize, here comes the word salad, throw everything out there. That's why the comedians imitate him by making him sound like someone who's just smoked a really fat joint. And what happens is, when you do that, you think of something and then you associate to something else, and then you associate, and pretty soon you're way out in left field. It has nothing to do with where you started, but the person is following you along because, like someone who wears a red hat, red is communist, and communists are bad, and communists lived in Russia, and Russia is east of Germany. It's just totally nonsensical. Yeah.
I would say how it can be done well, though. Can I give two artistic examples of where people use the same technique to incredible but different effect? One of them is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, the Nobel Prize winner for literature, who actually has sentences in one of his novels that will go on for 10 pages and they have no end. And you're going through subclasses, and you go, what the heck? But you can't stop because you're mesmerized, because he is a brilliant writer with an incredible capacity to create a mythological realm. And in the mythological realm, you don't want to put a stop to it. It is actually a wonderful way of creating and weaving a spell. And I would say the Wagner's, and I've talked about this before, does it with music as well. He basically does the same thing. By not resolving a chord, you're like on the edge of your seat going, when is he going to resolve that chord in Tristan and Isolde? So there are places where you can use this to incredible effect and mesmerize and
yes.
But everything, and I think we always go back to this, we talk about this, everything has a shadow side. And these characters are definitely indulging in the shadow side of things, where you are definitely out there to not create transcendence, but to actually create something very, very different. Anyway, that's what I see as a correspondence.
I mean, in other words, you're getting at that we already covered the Pluto, how the downside of it is being expressed pretty obviously, and then you get the Uranus Venus, even in small ways. If you end the relationship through text, I mean, that's a classic Uranus Venus maneuver. Uranus Venus can be incredibly irresponsible if a person doesn't have the conscience to integrate it properly. And then the Neptune Sun, and on the one hand thinking you're Jesus, but at the same time you also have a past as a drug addict, because Neptune Sun can be tremendously escapist. And then the whole idea that you're in a realm where you have this opposition, and you are trafficking in delusion on some level. You really are. I mean, and if he believes it, great, but that doesn't help me, and it doesn't help society. If he believes it, he needs to, get in deeper and figure it out. It's that simple,
Yeah, I don't know. I don't really know. I think that's the problem with the trickster figure. You really don't know what they believe and they don't believe, what is done for profit, what is done for power. And if we were only just that, but the fact that you brought up from the very beginning is this is a chart with a lot of outer planetary contacts to the inner planets. Therefore, it's driven by archetypal energies he probably has very little control over.
That's true.
Work, right, to be able to do it. And he's tried. I mean, clearly he has, gone down the spiritual route, but they're very hard to control. But again, I do think it's like a little bit like the Trump phenomenon. We cannot discount that people are attracted to this because they themselves are carrying similar archetypal forces, or they wouldn't be there. You just wouldn't resonate, because a lot of us don't. We listen to him, we think you're insane, stop. But there are many who don't. So I'm curious about that, because I think the individual is really a carrier for something that is collective. And I guess because of my history background, I'm really interested in the collective forces that allow people of this nature to rise to power. And we've seen it before, not even that long ago, with tremendously horrible effects. So, we should be on guard about it. And I think the only way to be on guard, and I will always go on, you've talked about this, is you have to examine your own inner world to see what is attracting you and why. I think that's just a great entry point.
And by the way, I mean, this goes to in a way, one of the big arguments in, I don't know so much in science, but it shows up with people that are mystically inclined, but also scientists. And there's this argument around, is the universe consciousness, or is the universe actually matter? And most people that are I'm going to say you and I almost certainly, we see it, we're more likely to understand it as consciousness for all kinds of reasons. But one of the implications of that is the sense that we're all the same being. So then you're more likely to respect other people's spaces and treat them as you would want to be treated. You know, the famous Christian golden rule, right? But the less you relate to that, the more, particularly if you become famous and you think you're special and you've got something that other people don't have, then you start deciding, well, you know, I mean, in the end, so what if I do this with this woman? It's good for her anyway because I'm so special, and they don't even think that they're causing sometimes horrible damage to a person. You know, they could leave them wounded and that's because there's no, as you put it, that's the idea that if you do enough of that connection where you realize you're part of a bigger being, so that's your conscience informing you all the time. Okay, do I really want to do this? Because if I do this, you know, it's not ethical, it's harmful, etc. Right? And my sense with this guy is, yeah, there's a lot of energy being expressed here that it is not wholesome. It's gone off the rails, you know, and it's because of his stature, because he's built the power. He has it, right?
Yeah.
So, you know.
So now I'll leave it to you you've mentioned Pluto obviously is in a key spot, and it could be that he's you know, you can create a narrative around your life. So he might have been born like 15 minutes after 12. He's probably not an Aquarius rising because Pluto is too active. But
no. And by the way, he looks like a Capricorn rising.
Oh, does he? Okay.
He does. You see that doesn't his face remind you a little bit of Cassidy Hutchinson's?
Interesting, because you think Cassidy Hutchinson's also.
I'm almost certain she's Capricorn rising, and in her case, Saturn in Aries. So there's an Aryan look to an angularity to the face. In this guy's case, Saturn is in Cancer, so you'd have to bring in a combination of the longer face, but with a Cancer.
Yeah, Cancer look at that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the logic there, and.
So with the point is though, is Pluto's right now there, and it's there till really doesn't get out till 2024, 25. When does
Well, it gets out at the end of next year, and it's out most of next year because next year you can see it here. Pluto spent a little bit of time in Aquarius this year, but next year it's in Aquarius from February to October, basically, and then it spends a couple of months in Capricorn, and then the full Aquarius, where it doesn't return, is December and forward into, you know, the next 20 years or whatever. So, but the thing is, then it will release the pressure on the ascendant, but then that's when Saturn enters Aries.
Well, that's what I was going to say, that he's.
So that's the frying pan into the fire, you know.
Yeah, he's got, and so of course Saturn for him is the key planet, being the ruler of his chart. So he doesn't look like he's going to have a good time for a good long while, you know, on this. And you know, you generally think about that I think Saturn especially makes you pay for your sins, you know. If you've been misbehaving, Saturn certainly knows how to come up and ask you to pay up. And so if there's any kind, because now the police in the UK are actually asking for women to step up and report any kind of misbehavior. If there's any kind of trial, you don't want it with Saturn around, because you will definitely be in a very, very precarious situation.
Exactly, and the thing is, you see that if he's Capricorn rising, we're pretty much assuming. So that means 2, 3, 4, 8. 8 out of 11 points are cardinal houses, and Saturn is going in there, so guaranteeing the scandal of it, but also, yes, the accountability. Saturn is the one. I know this from watching from my own, you know, I like watching crime shows to see if I can guess the person's, they'll say the date and I can anticipate, oh yeah, that's when Saturn entered, you know, they'll be committing crimes, and then Saturn switches signs, and then they get, you know, the police knocks on the door. We have the DNA or whatever it is, right? So it's not a good scene when you see this coming up, because it's not that far away. You know, this thing will now churn and churn. Jupiter's going into Gemini, so he may have a bit of a surge here next year when Jupiter's in Gemini. I would be curious. This is, again, the astrology is the train in motion. So watch to see what's happening, to hear what's happening, to gauge how he's using the Jupiter or how things are going. But I don't think it'll be enough to save him.
Well, here's a question for you, because you do more consulting type work. Would the fact that his Saturn is exactly square Jupiter at birth not make that Jupiter a little bit more, a little bit less likely to be, it won't maybe bring the bigger significations in a positive sense because it's in a pretty troubled relationship at
Yeah, that's
birth,
a great
right?
point because you're seeing it in a square. Yeah,
Yeah. So it
it
brings Saturn into the conversation no matter what it goes, but it brings Saturn with it.
yeah,
So I'm
no,
just
and
wondering.
the logic that also Saturn, although it's smaller but not still a huge planet. Jupiter's the biggest, but in the astronomy, but Saturn, because it's further out, tends to be more impactful in transits than Jupiter. So Jupiter is unlikely to save you ever if Saturn is really on you in a major
Right,
way. And a chart like this, now it's interesting. When did he, in a way, he went off the rails? Was when Saturn was in Capricorn because that
right.
was during the pandemic. So
That
so
was
that Jupiter Saturn Pluto conjunction that the astrologer Andre Barbeau, my namesake, in 2011, he realizes, yeah,
mhm,
there's going
yeah,
to be a
yeah,
pandemic. The three planets clustered, right? So those three planets were turning this whole thing on, right?
right,
And
right.
I bet you anything, it'll surface that, well, maybe not anything, but here's a guess, right? That he may have done some of his worst stuff when in that it'll surface that during the pandemic somehow
Right,
he got involved in unsavory things because the Jupiter, Saturn, Pluto, they were over here in the
right,
squaring the all the planets and opposing all the planets, right? And then
right.
Aries, that's where it's going to go next. So
Well, one thing that's interesting that we didn't mention till we talked about that Saturn Jupiter is if you looked at this chart, you wouldn't think that that kind of craziness would be involved with a Capricorn, which is quite refined usually, and not exactly the most explosive ascendant, and then Saturn and Cancer is water. You would think about it, but I think it's that Jupiter that makes it kind of crazy. It overdoes that. Like he has an too muchness about him that I quite recognize very much, which is a very Jupiter kind of thing. He's over the top and kind of crazy, and I think that is that square that's driving it because it's such an exact. I mean, that's the most exact aspect he has in his chart,
yeah,
and it's the
yeah,
ruler of his chart. So when you see him, he does not behave like a classical Capricorn rising or someone with Saturn Cancer. He behaves more with that Jupiter, like overdoing it, too many words, too much everything. There's just the way he
yeah.
dresses, his persona. It's very big. It's a big
It's true.
persona.
It's true. It's true. And if you look at a Jupiter Saturn thing like that, you could go in both directions. So the Jupiter will, in a sense, harm the Saturn or can harm the Saturn by bringing in what you were just saying, the too much, over the top. But the other side can be true too, that he did get himself out of the drugs. That's Saturn clamping
Yeah.
down on Jupiter and going, stop, this is not good. And so, in fact, I would be curious. I didn't look it up, but a really good point to be made here would be when did he do that? Because what I notice is that you'll almost always find the Saturn active and pressuring the person. People never change. Well, very rarely do I see Jupiter causing a person to work at anything. Jupiter doesn't like working.
No, no,
That's
not at all.
Saturn is the one that says, okay, time to get serious here, right? So that would be the plus side. But overall, yeah, you're right. I mean, for example, if you put it in the seventh with Venus, seventh Saturn would normally stabilize something. It would want to have a committed relationship, but then with Jupiter squaring, Jupiter's kind of going, no, no,
Too much. Yeah.
break it up, and yeah, it wouldn't be the same. It would be
I mean,
more.
as Saturn is just even it has a very wide square to Uranus by sign. It's definitely square, but he's got two markers of that kind of just unsettled energy. But that Jupiter, yeah, because if you look at it, I mean, I don't really associate a Capricorn rising. The ones I know are not over the top like that. But if you put Jupiter anywhere, I find that it does actually increase the likelihood that you're getting a character that is, by the way, he's a comedian. That's very Jupiterian. He makes people
Yeah,
laugh. So
yeah,
that's the positive side. The shadow side is if you're around him, if you're around his public persona and you're watching it, there's just, yeah, you just get the sense of clamp it down. There's too much happening.
yeah. I
And
mean,
that,
you notice that the Neptune opposite Sun, you get a trine to Jupiter in this direction,
right,
and then you get a sextile in this direction. So he's resolving it. He resolves the tension of the opposition through Jupiter,
right,
and Jupiter is the comedian. It's true. The idea of laughter,
right,
mirth type thing. But then also all the problems that can bring, though, because Jupiter, since they in astrology, you see these planets, the ranges, right? So Jupiter high end. I mean, if you think about it, if Jupiter is the first ruler of Pisces, and I think it is, then Jupiter is the most spiritual planet. It's the planet that is most likely to illuminate you. But that's on the very high end. It starts to descend, and it turns into a party machine and overindulgence and going over the top and exaggerating. And in that sense, it's not a positive thing. And that's the mystery of looking at charts and trying to figure out what is this person doing with a certain planet. Right?
I also think Jupiter is very much tied to our belief system, and it's
Yes.
his belief system that he's cashed in on, right? Saturn ruling the second house of money and resources. What is he selling if not a belief system, and what you should deny and what you should follow, and who, whatever. It's all about that. He's not running a music, he's not a musician. So to me, that's also Jupiter very much being active. And then, there are two planets that are particularly strong in this chart. One of them is Mercury being in Gemini, so the communication aspect. Second one is Mars and Aries. That's a warrior big time. And one of the things he does is he does harness that kind of energy, right?
Yeah. And also Mars and Aries next to Eris, which is not just martial, it's ultra competitive as well. Eris is a very competitive driving energy, and it can be tricky to understand because normally with Eris you talk about, for example, if a woman has a strong Eris, she represents that principle more and will advocate for herself in the world of men and so forth. But in a male chart, you put it next to something, competitiveness, including all the way to cutthroat, competing to win at all costs. That's one of Trump's things. He's got that Eris, Mercury, Neptune, T-square. And this guy, Eris is conjunct Mars opposite Pluto. It's very intense, the force of this planet, right? But that's another bit of bad news because Eris is glacially slow in its transit, but now it's moving up to square his ascendant. If he's born at midnight, then it's almost within the next few years, it's going to square the horizon, and then eventually it'll square Venus. So, depending on how well he manages himself, but we'll see, right? I think he has to go through, if I had to guess, he has to go through the next easily, I'm going to say, 4 to 5 years to undo the damage before he might, recover and do some other. Matter of fact, didn't I see something here? Oh, well, okay, in the lunation, he's on a full moon. Look at where look in the progressions, how the progressed sun is near as Venus. So, but it's square as Uranus. You see that this progressed sun has brought out the conflict of what he did with the Venus-Uranus, which when you think of what he did, the Plutonian part is the overpowering part, but the irresponsible, I do this for me, that's the Uranus thing, where you don't think of the other person's well-being, and then the sun now is revealing it, so to speak.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I haven't looked at the progressed chart, but and of course the full moon is the moment in the lunation cycle where you are most under the lights, right? But then
and you know what it is? The full moon is the fruition. Like the best example of full moon, where you would say fruition, reaching the pinnacle. Barack Obama was in the White House on the full moon cycle of his new moon that he started in the 90s. So, and he actually left the White House. There's like an 8-year swath when the moon is really bright. And that's when he was president. Then he left.
Yeah.
But Al Gore was on a full moon when he lost the election. So it was now, of course, then you could say, well, that's what led him to being a climate advocate, and maybe it was a good thing. But in terms of his apparent ambition, it was a crash. I think with this guy, he's on a full moon. This is revealing, I think, some pretty bad things that he must have started on the new moon, because you don't want this on a full moon, because you're being before the world. It's the idea that it's the disappointment of the cycle, right? Which started 15 years ago when the moon and sun would have been in Cancer somewhere.
And another thing that won't help him over the next, if you just do a quick calculation, over the next, say 4 or 5 years, that Venus then moves into to square that natal sun, which isn't going to be helpful for him either.
Oh yeah, up here, the progressed Venus.
Yeah, because that progressed Venus story. Yeah, so then again, another marker that this isn't going to be either by transit or by progression. This isn't going to be a particularly easy time, no matter the outcome. And who knows? So many things are probably yet to be revealed. The people who saw, I did not see the documentary was made, but it was very well researched. And one of the journalists who talked about it afterwards said, I know, and this is kind of an interesting thing she said, I know of another person with that kind of level of power who has abused women, but I cannot say their name. And the reason I can't is I would lose my house. And because I don't have sufficient, what her point was, I do not have sufficient proof. If you see this published in the major publications, unless you're Fox News, where you're willing to be sued for $1 billion, most publications won't do that because they do not want to lose their shirts. That's why they have a group of lawyers always advising them. So you can be sure that they research this, and you may have belief systems and say he didn't do it. I don't know. I wasn't there. I have no idea. But I will trust the researchers who are staking their reputations and literally their homes to say, I've worked on this 4 years. There's a lot of credible evidence, and it's good that the public knows this, right?
Yeah. And you know, and this is the thing right back here. The new moon happens in the relationship sign, and the scandal on the full moon is because of relationships.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because of what he
Which
did
are
there.
a problem with him at birth. He brings that signature to that Uranus square Venus right from birth, right?
Well,
so we're going to put down in, yeah.
And the ruler of the seventh is the moon, opposite Pluto. I mean, this is
Right.
complicated
So
stuff. So you've got
complicated
two
stuff. Yeah.
major planets that they're quite unstable until you figure them out. They're unstable because the logic with outer planets is that they are, you could call them collective supernormal forces, and the ego gets really tempted to
Right.
take them on and say, oh, this is me. I can just do this, give myself permission. Yes, you can give yourself permission to do certain things, but there are others that it's risky. Because why? Because the collective will come after you. It's why the collective, you know, it's the logic of how when you're doing, say, power practices, anything you do to empower yourself, if the ego gets too big, it'll turn on you because society will reject you because you're taking advantage. You know,
Right.
there's a sense that you should be, you know, honoring, you know, principles of fairness. Let's just call it that, right? So
I'll leave everybody with this notion, though. There are a lot of defenders, just like there are defenders of people, you know, like Trump, that are out there, who are out there, you know, and will defend him to the death, and will consider what we're saying, you know, whatever they'll go. So again, I would say that the value in looking at these charts is not to condemn him or to say it's true or not. I don't care. I mean, I don't know. I don't know him personally. If he did damage, then I believe we should be revealed, because a lot of women are damaged by men like this. But for me, it's always an invitation to say, if I'm hooking into one of these people, right? If I'm being attracted to their ideology, maybe it's a good time to just look at what might be going on inside that might be making me susceptible to that. So that's why I would leave it with people, because otherwise all you're doing is trying to, you know, predict. That's fine, but I think we also have to look at who is drawing us in, and what's the possible reason. So I think that's where it can be a really great tool to grow and to evolve, and not just to leave it as, you know, kind of a parlor game, which it isn't. So I would leave it with that, you know?
yeah, right. You know, and in the notion too that you're doing things and you're in cycles, and there are risks to what you do because the cycles keep circulating and the planets will find you. That's the logic of Saturn bringing you to accountability, or even Pluto in this case. Pluto here, it's been in the background, and then it gets to the, you know, it reminds me of, it gets to the line here, right? And it's on his ascendant. Well, Bill Gates, it was on the other side when he was divorced, right on that point. And it had been traveling there for years and years and years. But that's around astrology. You know, astrology shows you these crazy coincidences, which are not coincidences. It's actually the art of, you know, meaningful coincidence. That's what astrology is. And in this case, it's not a happy scene. But I don't know what to tell you. I mean,
behave better.
yeah.
Be more
All right.
conscious.
Well,
anyway,
that was fun. That was a
Right.
long discussion. But yeah, this is what I like about this, is that it's very rich with astrological meaning. You know, when you look at all the different patterns, archetypal patterns, transit patterns, even the progress patterns are spooky, because you see the origin of the thing and then the culmination and so forth.
Absolutely.